Assalamualaikum dear students. I hope that you're fine and uh, doing good. I'm Zartash with the topic from your course Sociolinguistics, and the topic that I will be discussing is going to be lingua franca. I have already discussed this topic in our previous lecture as well, and in this lecture I will be discussing uh, some some aspects, certain things that we have missed in our previous lecture. We will talk about how English became lingua franca, what were the different phases, and what are the possibilities or the future of current lingua francas ahead. So I'll provide you a little quick overview, and then I will provide you a few documentaries. And in those documentaries, we'll see some history, some historical facts regarding lingua franca, how English and how other languages they developed into lingua franca, and how this thing is still going on, and what is the possible future for the languages. So, as you know, the most important element is basically language, and then we have all this dynamic around us. So, language is the means of communication, and it is what the members of a particular society think of it, they use it for, and language is basically fulfilling their requirements, their needs. The most important one is communication. Then we have to write down certain things, and in fact, life in order to in order to move ahead, it requires this basic element, which is called language. And sociolinguistics is interested in its study while relating it to society, because language is embedded into our society. It is embedded in the functions of the society. So if we want to learn what basically language is and how it operates, the simple way is to see it in relation to the society, that how society uses it, how society views it, how society adopts languages and abandon them. All these interesting dynamics are linked with society. So society is the context in which language is studied when it comes to sociolinguistics. And all this study, in fact, help us to map the development of languages. So when it comes to society, we have the concept of speech community. Speech community is a group of people, and they use a language in a unique but mutually accepted way. And so each speech community, the speech communities, they are distinct. They use certain languages. Those languages are their, in fact, identity. And in order to study those languages, we will have to study them in relation to their speech communities, because they are originating from those people, so they are embedded in their culture and their lives. So in order to study the dynamics of their language, then the context must be that speech community. So when it comes to lingua franca, as we already know, that it is a language which is used by those people whose mother tongue is different, but they need a language to facilitate their communication. Sometimes trade is the reason, sometimes knowledge is the reason. For instance, you are having several books in English written by foreign authors, and in order to read them, in order to get that knowledge, you will be requiring lingua franca English. So there are some books written by French writers and Italians and Germans and Pakistani, and they all are translated into English so that the global community can benefit from that knowledge. So it is not just a necessary condition that English should be second language or foreign language. Both things will work. There are some countries they have English as their foreign language, and in those countries, people they still learn English in order to facilitate their communication with the global community. And there are some people they have English as a second language, and they are learning it to benefit from it nationally plus internationally. I will provide you a glimpse of how English is it has its spread around the world as well. I'll provide you a short documentary on this subject as well, so that you can understand how English right now it has its influence over the around the globe. So it is sometimes called bridge language and common language and trade and auxiliary language. We have discussed these things already. You will see ahead. It performs various functions. There are commercial reasons, diplomatic reasons, and administrative convenience, and media, music, business, documents, sports, games, science, technology. There are plenty of others as well. So these are the functions which lingua franca performs. And the bit history we already know, and how it started, and it was once Arabic, which was lingua franca and still is. And now I will take you to our documentaries. First of all, I will provide you a documentary on English, how the three circles, and you will see how English has spread and its influence, and this thing will help you to understand how long this language is going to serve as lingua franca. Then I'll provide you some documentaries on its history and also what basically lingua franca is. So let's watch, and then I'll provide you a quick review.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth Variation in Language talk, organised through the Department of Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster University. My name is Luke Harding, and I'm going to be talking to you today about World Englishes and English as a lingua franca, implications of the spread of English. If you have any questions about the talk, please post them in the Q&A chat, and I will answer them at the end of the session. Okay, so it should be fairly well understood that over the past 300 years at least, English has spread across the world, and it is continuing to spread and change. This initial spread was driven, according to Schneider, by the expansion of the British Empire across the globe and the resulting colonization of parts of North America, Asia, Africa, and Australasia. As English spread to these parts of the world, it came into contact with a range of indigenous languages, and interaction between these languages led to new varieties of English. The range of varieties that emerged from this spread have come to be known as World Englishes. Now, we can conceptualize this spread in different ways, but one influential model of World Englishes is Braj-Kachou's three concentric circles. So in this model, which is shown on the slide here, there's thought to be an inner circle, an outer circle, and an expanding circle of English. So the inner circle includes countries like the USA, the UK, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia. These are the countries where English functions as the dominant language. Then there's the outer circle, which includes countries such as India, Sri Lanka, Jamaica, Ghana, Singapore, and Bangladesh. And these are typically countries that were previously colonized by Britain or later by the USA, such as the Philippines. And in these countries, English is used by some, but not all of the population, and it may be a first language for some and a second language for many. At the time when Kachu was writing, in the 1980s and 90s, it was thought that many of the countries in the outer circle had developed or were in the process of developing localized norms of grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. And finally, there's the expanding circle. And in these countries, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, most European countries, among many others, English is typically learned as a foreign language in school. Speakers in these countries will often use English for a range of instrumental purposes, like international business, consuming English language media, diplomatic communication, and so on. Now, I should mention that Kachu's model has been criticised for different reasons, and various other models of world Englishes have been proposed. But it's a useful model in many ways, I think, because it helps us to conceptualize how different contexts for English use map onto the historical patterns of the spread of English, either through colonialism or later through trade. So what is English as a lingua franca? Well, English as lingua franca is defined as communication in English between speakers with different first languages. So this accounts for lots of different communicative situations. So it could be, for example, a speaker in Japan speaking to someone in Germany through the medium of English, or it could be an Australian English speaker speaking with an Indian English speaker. It could be, there's a whole range of different combinations, but English as a lingua franca essentially tries to take account of all of these different uses of English among speakers with different lingua cultural backgrounds. Why is English as a lingua franca, or ELF, as I'll start to call it from here on, why is ELF an important concept? Well, English is now estimated to be spoken by about 25% of the world's population to some degree of proficiency. And moreover, more ELF conversations are estimated to take place daily than do conversations between native speakers, or the inner circle, the speakers of inner circle Englishes. So English is really being used extensively across the world by L2 or second language speakers. Now, early studies attempted to describe the regular features of ELF. So early studies into ELF tried to treat it essentially as another kind of world English variety. And there were studies into phonology, lexicogrammar, and pragmatics, trying to capture what is common across all these different ELF contexts. But this proved to be very difficult. And in fact, the current focus in ELF research has shifted to understanding what makes communication successful in contexts which are characterized as being fluid and dynamic. So the idea here is that the main characteristic of an ELF encounter is that it's highly unpredictable and highly context bound. So the speakers kind of make up their own rules and norms in the context in which they find themselves communicating. Now, this is expressed by Kanagaraja here as saying, ELF is intersubjectively constructed in each specific context of interaction, negotiated by each set of speakers for their purposes. Now, with this view of ELF, the research into its characteristics have then attempted to understand what are the key elements of ELF communication that allows for this kind of successful communicative outcomes. And these are the key themes, I guess, that come out of that kind of research. One is accommodation. Now, accommodation is the process of making yourself intelligible to an interlocutor, so your speaking partner, and also adjusting to your speaking partner's speech style, their accent, their way of communicating. And accommodation is absolutely central in ELF communication. Also central are the use of strategies to preempt or negotiate misunderstanding. So things like clarification, self-repair, repetition, paraphrasing, these are all extremely useful for being an effective communicator in an ELF setting. And then there's maintaining a smooth and collaborative interaction. So things like turn taking, knowing when to speak, when to interrupt, how to interrupt, and also using appropriate politeness strategies, which are appropriate for that particular context in which you find yourself communicating. So these are the key elements of ELF communication that have really come out of the research literature.
Hello and welcome to the online video lecture, English as Lingua Franca. My name is Mr. Sultan and this lecture is for the AP Human Geography course at Abraham Lincoln High School in San Francisco, California. This lecture will be one of the potential FRQs in the upcoming Chapter 6 exam. The topic of the lecture is English as Lingua Franca, or how did English become the worldwide language? So we're going to start the lecture with asking ourselves, what is a lingua franca? So we'll start with the historical definition. A lingua franca comes from the group of people known as the Franks, who in the Middle Ages traded throughout the Mediterranean. So here they are in their boats, and they're going really from port to port, from Italy to Sicily to North Africa, up into the Adriatic Sea, to Venice, to the island of Cyprus, to Crete, over to the Middle East, back to North Africa, and eventually returning home. So as these people traveled from port to port, they needed a language that they could speak to everyone in all of these different ports, because everyone in all of these different ports spoke different languages. You had French, you had Italian, you had Greek, you had Arabic, you had Spanish. So they developed a language that they could use while trading in all of these ports that everyone would be able to speak. And much of these languages actually contain some common words that you still find today. So this is the original lingua franca. The original definition is the common language spoken in the ports of the Mediterranean that was a mix of French, Italian, Spanish, Greek, and Arabic. So that's the original definition. But what is the definition today? Well, similar to back then, it's a common language. But today, a lingua franca means a language that facilitates communication or trade between people who speak different native languages. So for example, if I have a Hindi speaker who's traveling to Norway, there's a good chance that the Hindi speaker from India will probably not learn Norwegian, nor will the Norwegian person learn Hindi. However, they still need a language to communicate with each other, and that language is often going to be English. Today, English is the worldwide lingua franca. And this lecture is going to investigate why that is. So we're going to look at the story of how English became the worldwide lingua franca, and we're really going to examine two distinct features. We're going to look at historical factors first, and then we're going to examine the role that globalization plays. First, the historical factors. The first historical factor that we're going to discuss is British colonialism and imperialism. Beginning in the 15th century, Great Britain began to colonize and create an empire that really stretched over the entire globe, starting, as we can see here, in the Americas with Canada, 13 colonies, as well as small colonies throughout the Caribbean and even into Central America. The British Empire extended to every single continent by its completion. So that includes West Africa, East Africa, North Africa, South Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and even into Oceania through Australia, New Zealand, etc. As the British Empire spread to every continent, many former colonies still use English as their official language today, and that's because of the influence of the British Empire. While Britain was ruling these places and governing, English was the language of the British administration, and so therefore it remained even after the British Empire collapsed. Two examples include Nigeria and Ghana, linguistically diverse countries who've adopted English as their official language after British colonization ended. The second historical factor that we're going to discuss is the role of the United States military. Beginning with the 20th century, the United States became a big player on the world stage in terms of their military power. The picture we see here on the left is an example of a military base the United States constructed in the Philippines. The picture on the bottom is United States troops stationed in South Korea after the South Korean War. And this map shows us where the United States has either military facilities or troops stationed. So we can see that the U.S. has hundreds of military bases located all throughout the world and in other countries. Wherever a U.S. Army installation is located, a military base is, then the local communities are going to speak English to communicate and do business with the troops on that base. Some examples of that include in Japan and Germany after World War II, the United States occupied both countries after the war, built military bases, and those soldiers had a lot of contact with local populations, and that was one way historically that English spread as a lingua franca. The same is true for Korea after the Korean War. In the Philippines, the United States had either an occupation or a military presence from 1898, the Spanish-American War, all the way up until 1992 when the final U.S. military base was closed. Okay, the next topic we're going to talk about is what role globalization plays in terms of diffusing English throughout the world and cementing English's position as the worldwide lingua franca. So there's many factors involved in globalization and how globalization has helped to spread English and cement it as the worldwide lingua franca. Now I'm going to project some major identification points, but you're going to have to fill in, based on the descriptions, the details. So one way that English has spread around the world is through music and radio. In many different countries, people listen to English language broadcasts on the radio, they listen to English language music, and because of things like the worldwide transmission of radio and media, it's very easy to hear these artists, and they're played in every country. So that's one way that English has diffused throughout the world through music and radio. Here we can see one example of that, Justin Bieber, who's actually famous worldwide, and his music is famous in countries where people do not speak English as their native language. Another factor is film, television, and sports. Through the wide distribution and popularity of American and British visual media like Hollywood films, Disney animation, American television shows, British television shows, American TV, commercials, the worldwide popularity of the NBA, basketball, as well as the popularity of baseball in the Western Hemisphere, America and Great Britain have been able to spread their culture and with it their language throughout the world, promoting English as the worldwide lingua franca. Example here is the Fast and Furious 7, which did millions and millions of dollars worldwide when it opened. Another factor is the internet. A lot of internet development started here in the US. The United States is really the hearth of some of the most important internet companies. Here you see pictured Google, Wikipedia, Instagram, and Twitter, all of which produce content in English on the internet. And so many users, regardless of what spoken language that they use, they type in English online. So I think it's about 70% of all internet content is created in English, despite the fact that less than half of the users on the internet are English speakers. Another factor of how globalization has advanced English as the lingua franca is through aviation. The use of English in all international aviation operations for safety, navigation, and navigation is mandated. So that means that any pilot, regardless of where they are from, where they're flying to or where they are flying from, is going to be communicating with other pilots and with the air traffic controllers in the English language. English is the standard for aviation. Finally, we have the increase in tourism worldwide. So English is becoming the language of the international tourism industry. Hotel employees, taxi drivers, tour guides, travel agents, restaurant menus, airline personnel, signs, doctors, etc. All of these have to communicate in one language, and that language has become English. So as more and more people are earning enough money to travel around the world, to visit other countries, that means that more and more people are using English as a lingua franca in order to speak and get around. So this concludes the online lecture. I hope it was informative and entertaining. Good luck.
A quote often attributed to Holy Roman Emperor Charles V goes something like this: "I speak Latin to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse." Well, humorous, it shows the linguistic landscape of the 16th century. In such a fragmented world, one needed more than one language to survive. An odd idea for today, where 1.5 billion people around the world know English. Meaning, if you know English, you can hold a conversation with 20% of the human population. It is the modern lingua franca, the language of trade, commerce, and travel. But lingua franca? What is that? When talking about the lingua franca, it is important to differentiate. Lingua franca applies to two distinct concepts: the difference between lowercase lingua franca and uppercase lingua franca. Lowercase lingua franca refers to the linguistic category or concept of lingua franca, meaning, exactly, a language that is adopted to communicate between two speakers whose native languages are different. Today, when some refer to lingua franca, they are most likely referring to this modern term, but it is from the uppercase lingua franca this concept is derived. The uppercase lingua franca refers to an exact language, or a linguistic mystery, a simplified trade language used in the Mediterranean mainly between the 13th and 17th century. While it is not constant through its poorly recorded history, enough evidence exists to suggest it was linguistically romantic in nature, but it was not the first lingua franca, lowercase. Earlier in history, Latin took the role of lingua franca, and many other languages would follow after in a similar vein. So how did this Mediterranean lingua franca come to be? Mediterranean lingua franca was largely a product of contact between European Christians and Middle Eastern Muslims, close exchange that resulted from European expansion into the Mediterranean, as the Crusades brought the two societies into much closer contact. A contact that facilitated both warfare and trade. Not only was a language between Europeans and Arabs necessary, but so was one between fellow Christians. Few within the great mass of the Crusades shared any language. Even some who did found each other's dialects unintelligible. While the educated lords knew Latin, even this was not enough. Very few crusaders could write their own language, much less speak Latin, meaning the vast majority of troops were both illiterate and often isolated into cultural groupings. As such, a sort of simplified, utilitarian language was developed, later evolving into lingua franca. Very little of lingua franca was ever written, being a verbal jargon that developed to communicate bare necessities, meaning much of its history is obscure and early forms completely forgotten. It likely emerged as a pseudo-Italian dialect referred to as Franco in the 1100s, one probably used among soldiers in the Holy Land, suggesting lingua franca developed in the Levant among Europeans. But following military exploits in the Middle East brought it further. Soon it began to be employed between European and Arab traders, as the newfound goods in the East were desired by Europeans. This early form of lingua franca was adopted to facilitate exchange. Because of its usefulness, lingua franca as a trade language soon expanded across the Mediterranean, becoming a vernacular to both sailors and merchants. By the 13th century, lingua franca had fully emerged as a unique language, to a disputable degree of the word. The linguistic diversity of the Mediterranean region made multilingualism a necessity, especially for trade. Lingua franca became the language of trade purely on how versatile and easy its simplicity was. The The fluctuating borders of the Mediterranean from the 13th to 18th century made language and politics fluid, so a distinct common language was important. First appearing in the Levant, lingua franca was common to both Christians and Muslims, as it was a mixture of both Italian and Spanish adopted to Arab syntax, with it later adopting other terminology depending on which power's language was the most dominant in the region. Employed by both merchants, pirates, and slaves, lingua franca was heavily modified by the speaker's native tongue. With Venice being the most dominant trade power in the region, lingua franca, for most of its history, was highly Italian-influenced. But was lingua franca exactly Italian? Records written in lingua franca are largely non-existent, as it was never a literary language, or was it intended to be. Those who could write were often educated enough to write in Italian, the then diplomatic tongue of the Mediterranean, meaning writing in a fragmentary imitation of Italian would be pointless, leaving only vague and conflicting observations by outsiders, who were often unacquainted with the language. While attested by many, few travelers were ever desperate enough to speak such a guttural tongue as lingua franca. Because of its vulgar simplicity, it is often suggested lingua franca was just poorly spoken Italian, one used by foreign merchants, uneducated sailors, and slaves who had no concept of the language. To a degree, this is true. Many at the time spoke multiple languages, but few spoke any with any proficiency. Lingua franca was at least partly derived from Italian, a language its speakers probably had little fluency in, meaning it evolved from the earlier, more obscure Franco used by the Crusaders, until trade began to employ it for wider use, developing from a sort of dialect into a pidgin language. At the very least, lingua franca was based on the Latin-derived Romantic languages. In the Western Mediterranean, the power of Castile and Aragon, later united as Spain, gave it a Spanish persuasion. As attested by Miguel Cervantes in Don Quixote, where he referred to lingua franca as a mixture of all languages, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, developing Italian features, where it was referred to by Jean-Jacques Rousseau as a sort of Levantine Venetian, as then, Venice was the dominant trade power in the region, reinforcing lingua franca's possible Italian origins. While rarely used by educated Europeans, lingua franca was widely employed in North Africa, where, centuries earlier, Spanish Muslims had fled to, followed by European renegades in the following centuries. Combining European outlaws, Maghrebi rulers, and an assortment of slaves, a shared language was necessary, as many, either for revenge or fortune, raided Mediterranean trade as pirates. A language found in lingua franca, which was used in both trade and governance in the region. A shared trait for the populations of Muslim corsairs and European pirates, populations famous for raiding Mediterranean trade until the 19th century. Lingua franca did, in fact, persist longer in northern Africa than the rest of the Mediterranean. The best recorded branch of lingua franca was a French-influenced one that survived in the Barbary States, one studied during the French invasion of Algiers in the 1840s. It was later referred to as saber by scholars, but under direct French influence, the dialect soon vanished, replaced by actual French, a language much more useful in the now French-suppressed and colonized Algeria. As colonial European ambitions expanded into the Mediterranean and Africa, lingua franca was soon discarded. European empires soon began to regulate trade and make use of their own languages, meaning multilingualism was much less of a necessity. In the colonial bureaucracy, it was better to proficiently know your superior's language rather than know scarcely a few of them. Contact between Europeans, Middle Easterners, Africans, and Asians became much more regulated, meaning lingua franca could be abandoned for much more useful languages, in a more standardized diplomatic system. So, without purpose, lingua franca slowly withered away into obscurity. But its obscurity does not mean it never existed. Scholarly interest in the 20th century ignited a search for information on lingua franca. But what has been turned up is little of substance, be it either bad Italian or an actual language. Lingua franca existed in some form. The later French branch is much better recorded, but information on the earlier Italian and Spanish varieties is basically non-existent. Every facet of lingua franca is highly disputed, even its name. The terminology of lingua franca's name is based around the term franca. While Italian in form, the term is most likely much older, deriving from either Arabic, Greek, or another language. Some take the term franca to mean free, suggesting a mercantile naval origin. Others believe it derives from the term franc, a word used by Arabs to refer to all Europeans, which itself evolved from the original word franc for the French, thus eventually becoming the Italian lingua franca, or Frankish language. And with the language so mired in mystery, both origins are completely possible, but no conclusive information exists to confirm or deny either one, and it most likely never will. While it was not the first lingua franca is perhaps the most interesting of its type, if only for its obscurity and long, bizarre history, touching nearly every port in the Mediterranean. Its emergence was just as chaotic as its existence and its end. What can be concluded is that lingua franca seemed so prevalent in Mediterranean life, it was irremarkable, until it was gone, leaving a multitude of tantalizing but inconclusive accounts and references. A unique language, or just bad Italian and Spanish. In the eyes of outsiders, it was something strange and remarkable. But lingua franca was never meant to be put to pen and paper, or video for that matter.
So, welcome back. I hope that you have enjoyed the documentaries, the video clips that I've included. And as you have seen, that how English it's spread, it is in 3 circles, and you can see that these 3 circles are in fact the globe, and it has spread across the globe, and it is serving as the language of communication, trade, and it is a bridge that is linking the entire world. And you also watched a little bit history, how it emerged, and warfare, and the world order at that time. It played an important role, because when it comes to the promotion of a language, war plays a very important role. Also, knowledge. The language in which the knowledge is readily available. That's what I'm talking about. As you can see now, that if you wish to learn something, a book written by a French writer, you don't know how to read French, but you know how to read English. So there will be a translation available, readily available, and internet and other facilities will make it happen. So that's how our language, it becomes a global bridge for a community, and it is hard for us to avoid it. And as I have told you earlier as well, that there are not just language, which is lingua franca. There are lingua francas, many of them. For instance, in Africa, there are 20 to 30 lingua francas. Similarly, in Asia, there are much more languages, but they serve as lingua francas for a limited population and a limited area. And when it comes to English, it is serving a lot of people and a lot of area. So that's how it operates. So I hope that the concepts, they're quite clear, and we have discussed almost all of the aspects of lingua franca, and I hope that you have enjoyed this lecture, as it was interesting to watch history and in the form of animation. If you have any questions, let me know. I will try to answer them. So that's all for our today's lecture. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.